Good evening and welcome to the American University Museum at the Katzen Art Center. Thank you for braving the dark and stormy night. I'm sorry that the curator for the exhibition, Judith Stein, will not be able to participate in this discussion, but there's a wonderful catalog with her interview with Keith, and if you want to find out what she had to say about Keith. But we have Keith right here, right from the horse's mouth. Keith was born in Jamaica in 1942 and came to the United States at the age of 17 to enroll at the Art Institute of Chicago, where he received his bachelor's and master's degree in art. I know him because he was an important figure in Washington for many years while he was teaching at the University of Maryland, and I knew him as an abstract artist. Keith went on to great acclaim in San Francisco and now Philadelphia. But I thought I would like to start out by asking Keith about his childhood in Jamaica and his passage from Jamaica to Chicago to Washington, D.C. And I'm particularly interested in your time in Washington. It was the 60s and 70s, after all. Can you tell us a little bit about, the early years?
Is this on? You got something working? You're talking about my years in Washington?
Yeah, speak into that.
Well, I lived in Chicago after finishing art school and worked as an artist, taught there too, University of Illinois, but worked as an artist, as an abstract painter, and showed all around Chicago. In fact, I represented Chicago in other places, represented Chicago in Germany, and won awards in Chicago, showed museums in Chicago. But then I decided I needed to leave Chicago. I'd spent too many years there. And I didn't really come to the US to settle in one place, really. And my friend David Driscoll invited me to the University of Maryland here. So I came to Washington. I had known Sam Gilliam before. Sam and I spent good evening together in my studio in Chicago some years before that. And I knew several other artists in Washington. So I moved to Washington, I think late in 79, and stayed here through 92. And as Jack knows, I was an abstract painter when I came to Washington. And I had been what I like to call a closet figurative painter for years. I would not really show my figurative painting. I would show my abstract painting. I showed my figurative painting a little bit, a few places, but not in any central place. And I continued to do the same thing when I came to Washington. I loved abstract art. I studied in school. I didn't study figurative painting. When I went to the Art Institute of Chicago, there were students there from all over the world, students from China, from Japan, from Austria, from Brazil, from India. But the faculty took this kind of position that you can wear any sari, dashiki, togo, or whatever you want. You can speak any funny language you want. But in my classroom, you will do abstract expressionism. So we all, people from Africa, wherever we came from, we learned to do abstract expression. I had a friend who was doing Israeli abstract expression. So I began to do, my version of Jamaican abstract expressionism. Since there was no Jamaican there to challenge what Jamaican abstract expressionism was, I got away with it. But on a more serious vein, I loved abstract art. I didn't know it when I was in Jamaica. I'm not sure I'd ever seen an abstract painting before I came to Chicago. But all of the interesting artists that I knew at that time were doing it. So I learned the language and really got into it. And when I came to Washington, I continued that. And some of the things in my paintings here, and my paintings since I became a figurative artist, really involve issues, ideas that I developed as an abstract painter. I didn't leave abstract painting because I thought it was a bad idea. I left it because I felt that there were things in my life, experiences, ideas, that language in itself did not fully satisfy. for me. I mean, artists I loved, Frank Stella, Ellsworth Kelly, Richard Diebenkorn, and still love them. But, and was influenced by them quite a bit. But as I worked, I realized that their ideas were coming from their own sources, their own indigenous sources. And my ideas, which related to them, I came to feel, were in part following their ideas. And I felt that I'd rather be a failure pursuing my own things than be a footnote to somebody else's legacy. So I said, well, I'm going to plunge into this figurative stuff. And so that's how I did. In Washington, I transitioned from figuration to abstraction. Now, mind you, I could have done that in Chicago, but Washington was a different kind of place. Washington was a more accommodating place for varying ideas than Chicago was. Chicago artists then, and I understand still today, walk around like gangs. I won't talk to you because you do this kind of stuff. I won't talk to you because you do that kind of stuff. In Washington, there was not that paradigm. Washington people were very accommodating for different kind of ideas. And so I doubt that I would have done it nearly so easily or so comfortably in Chicago as I did in Washington.
So we know that you came from Jamaica. You could be called a Jamaican artist, I guess, but it's, as I try to tell people, it's sort of way more complicated than that, because you've, well, the title of your show is Passages, and it hints at an artistic trajectory that begins in Africa and eventually, through a very circuitous route, ends up in Philadelphia. In there, San Francisco, is all the influences of San Francisco Bay Area, figurative school, and everything, funk art, and everything was going on there. And then Chicago had its own thing, and Philadelphia, I'm sure, does. And Washington had Washington Color School. So you've been influenced by all kinds of people, and what you end up with here is really kind of a very interesting mix of sources that seems to be uniquely your own. I'm really particularly interested in the ship-like forms that we see around the gallery. There's one right behind you, and there's this whole wall is ships, and ships here and ships there. I wonder if you could talk about those ships. They're really, I find them very powerful.
Well, the ship, in a sense, is iconic for the transportation of slaves. African people came to the Americas by ship. And as a Caribbean person from childhood, I was aware of, in school, people talked about all the times about ships and the movement of ships. Now, interestingly enough, when I was a child, or even as a youngster in high school, people really didn't talk about slavery. They talked about ships carrying merchandise and ships carrying produce from the Americas to the so-called mother country, which was Britain. And as a friend of mine today, who's a British scholar, says Britain has this thing in his mind that slavery was something the Americans did that people didn't really do that. So people don't really talk about slavery, in my experience, but we were very much aware of the transportation. People talked a lot about Columbus, and there are even like second B-rate movies about Christopher Columbus coming to the New World. I remember my friends and I sitting in the movie theater and enjoying pictures of Christopher Columbus coming to the New World to discover. It didn't really occur to us that we were the cargo in some way in any of this. But so...
What I just learned from your catalog was that actually the first slave ships came over before the Mayflower.
Yes.
So that's sort of mind-boggling.
Yeah, a slave ship
that sets the context pretty well.
Came here a year, I believe, before the Mayflower. Mayflower came in 1660 or something. 1659, I believe, a slave ship came. The first, well, maybe others came before, but perhaps the first recorded one. But African people came here by ships. They didn't come through Ellis Island, didn't come through anywhere else, but by ships. In the Caribbean was the center place where slavery and trade was bartered and introduced. And of course, the Caribbean was much, much more important than the continent, until maybe 300 years ago. So the center of the Caribbean being really the foundation for slavery in America and the transportation of slaves through the ships became iconic for me. If you look at the paintings, for example, this one right here, this very dark one, or this one, which I'm trying to find one, or this one right here, you'll find this kind of trapezoid form, which I used to use when I did abstract painting. And I remember a gallery dealer once asked me, what do you mean, what does that mean? I said, I really don't know, but I like the shape, I like the geometry. But as I got into figuration, I found a use for it. And in fact, I found it taught me the psychological interest that I had in it, which has to do with displacement, which has to do with a sense of changed space. And paintings often inform me. I don't really inform my paintings, they kind of inform me. I work on them often intuitively. And then as I work on them, they give me problems, and intellectual problems. They challenge me. What do you mean by that? Where did it come from? So I discovered through the trapezoid that sense of anxiety. And I've used it a lot to create a sense of enclosure, that you're actually going out of something. You're into the dark, or you're into an enclosure, and the space breaks for you and you open into it. Now, what you're seeing there as a slave ship is really a slave hold. And you, we are the slaves, or the people within, looking out onto that slave ship. And the idea is not an indictment necessarily of the people who created slavery, but it's a seeking of an empathy for me, for us, to gain a sense of humanity of what that is, of how it feels to be that. The ship morphs into, the slave hold morphs into, same trapezoid, morphs into the sea, the ocean, and the ship. But the ship is also kind of like a tomb. It's a tomb, and at the same time, it's a prison. So it's a conglomeration of all of those things. And those things, of course, the prison idea was not a slave idea, it's more of a contemporary idea. But the slavehold is similar. So it's like taking history through several centuries and collapsing it into several different things. And I mentioned earlier Richard Diebenkorn, an artist I loved and still do for his abstract forms. And I admired his door, which he'd look out the window or the door frame into what he called Ocean Park, which is in LA, in Oakland where he lived. There's no ocean there, but that's what it's called. And I had really admired that. But when I came to do these, I said, you know what? I found my own door, my own iconic door. Now, people have said to me, there was something gruesome, there's something morbid about that. And I said, yes, there is. There's something morbid and gruesome about slavery. But you know, if you think of it another way, most of us live in Western culture. And most of us live in a Christian culture, whether we're Christian or not. And what is the biggest, most beautiful icon in all Christian culture? It's the icon of some guy on a cross with holes bored through his hands, with blood coming down his head, with a spear in his side. What the hell could be more gruesome than that? I can't think of anything more gruesome than that. But what has happened? What has happened over centuries is that the culture has done what I guess the Greek word would be, it's like a catharsis, it's like a purging, it's like taking what is a very painful image and over time transforming it into an icon. And for me, that's what I'm trying to do. I'm trying to take ownership of the idea of slave culture, because that is my culture. My culture isn't Jesus Christ on the cross. It may have been, I don't know, but you know, I'm assuming it's not. My culture is this icon. And so I'm trying to do that with these paintings.
So interspersed with the ships, you have these beautiful, verdant, paradise-like landscapes. And I'm wondering, I mean, if this is Jamaica, I can't imagine a place that would have been more of a hell on earth than Jamaica for a slave, newly arrived from Africa. So what are you doing here? This is...
Well, because it's both. I mean, beauty is an interesting thing. You know, evil does not have a face. Evil can be absolutely the most beautiful thing you've ever seen in your life. And something that looks absolutely ugly can also be beautiful. So, and Jamaica or the Caribbean or whatever are beautiful places. And I'm not afraid, as an artist, I'm not afraid of beauty. Some artists shy away from it, I don't. I don't mind doing beautiful things. But often the beautiful things that I do, if they are indeed beautiful, often have double meanings. They're different kind of satirical or social issues embedded in them.
I was wondering if maybe it's as simple as when you were growing up, it must have been a beautiful place to grow up.
Oh, it was a beautiful place to grow up, and it still is. I don't live there very much, and the paintings that I do aren't about Jamaica or the Caribbean in a literal way. They're more memories or fantasies thereof. I like to recognize that I am an immigrant. You know, I'm a displaced person like everybody else here in a different way. But I tend to make paintings about memory much more than about the actual reality of something. And it's very important for me that I do that because I like to synthesize what happened in the past with who I am now. And many artists do that. Shakespeare did that, Cervantes did that, you know, Homer did that, Derek Walcott did that. Most artists, not most, but so many artists often do things about the past for several reasons. One is because people or life in the past can't challenge what you do. Nobody can challenge your authenticity because they're all dead or they've forgotten what it is. And also because you allow yourself the freedom to take liberties with it because you don't have to authenticate what is there. And a very important thing about using the past is that we believe that we're better than people in the past. So that if I do a painting about a social or political issue, people tend to believe that I'm not talking about them. I'm talking about somebody in the past. But I'm saying so many artists do that. I mean, if Shakespeare had done some of those things, those plays in his life about issues in his lifetime, he'd have been sent to jail, right? So I mean, he talks about Richard in the past. He talks about Macbeth in the past. So the idea is to really use the past as a metaphor for the present. And the landscapes which have, as you call verdant forms, as you describe them, are all about memory. They're not about any authentic place.
I also see the introduction of perhaps indigenous influence, and just adds more to the mix here. There's a lot of other kinds of influences coming through in your work.
The indigenous influence, the Meso-American influence, I'm not really sure why that came into my work, but it's been in my work for a long, long time, even when I did abstract painting. And I think I know some of the reasons, I'm not sure of all. The first Americans are Native Americans, and this is a country of immigrants. We're all here immigrants, and maybe Native Americans were immigrants at some time, but it's so long ago they were here. But if I talk about slavery, slavery was invented for Native Americans. It wasn't invented essentially firstly for Africans, it was invented for Native Americans. And I forget who, Bartolomeo de las Casas or somebody said to Queen Isabella that these people were working them because, the Indians you call them, because they're your slaves. And she was confused. She said, but they're my
subjects.
Thank you, my subjects. How can my subjects also be my slaves? He said, because you come with this elaborate theory because God made them secondary so they could serve us. So, then there are 200 million indigenous Native American people, and they're all gone. And there's something about, if you go around the country, when I go around this country, and I've traveled all around, lived all around this place, more than half the states have Indian names. Rivers have Indian names. Cities have Indian names. Where the hell are the Indians? They're very, very few. I mean, they're put off somewhere unless they're fortunate to get out of it into some, usually places nobody wants. And to me, there's a sense of this wonderful, beautiful graveyard that I'm living in. A graveyard of 200 million people, dead before black people came here. And so when I think of slavery, I can't but not think of Native Americans in the mix. And I know of a number of African American people, and white people too, whose ancestry are Native American. Some admit it, some, don't really want to do it. So that is, what I'm trying to do in a sense is come to terms, my own terms, with my own history. And Native Americans are a part of my history, just as Europeans are a part of my history. I may not always be allowed to claim the European blood in my veins, but Europeans are a part of my history. So I'm trying to come to terms with that. And I'm also trying to come to terms with slavery is done also by Africans. Slaves were sold by Africans. So there's a very complex history here. It does not in any way exonerate Europeans for what they did, but it does not necessarily make Africans any less culpable. So the whole sense of world history and world culture, my culture, as I feel it, is what I try to paint about.
So to complicate things a little bit more, I see a lot of religious references to other, whether it's Orishas or Native American or Christianity or a lot of things are going on here. I'm thinking of, I think everybody can see the painting out there of
Nanny of the Maroons.
Nanny Maroon. But I don't know if you want to start there, but
sure.
Are there...
Well, religion, I grew up in Jamaica, which is a very Christian place. It has different kinds of religions, but I grew up around a lot of religion, lived around a lot of religion. Religion permeates our culture, and it's Christianity, it's Judaism, it's Islam, it's Buddhism, it's different kinds of religion, and in different sects. And sometimes they're harmonious, sometimes they're in conflict, and all of that is a part of culture. And one of the things that I paint about, which often gets me in trouble, is that I'm not trying to tell a true story. I'm trying to tell a story about the complexities and contradictions of life. I tend to believe that most of the cultures that I know have contradictions. Most of the cultures that I know have truths, they have half-truths, they have lies, they have confusions, and I think that is healthy. It may not necessarily always be good, but it's kind of healthy in the sense that it's human. Human beings have contradictions, and to deny human contradiction is unhealthy. So I try to do a lot of that in the paintings. The one you referenced there, Nanny of the Maroons, Nanny, often called Queen Nanny, was a great Jamaican heroine. Nobody's really quite sure where Nanny was born, whether she was born in Africa or whether she was born in Jamaica. Different stories. Some people say she was born a slave in Jamaica and she became a maroon. Others say she was born a free person of royalty in Africa, which would probably be Ashanti. And she came to Jamaica, as did, by the way, many elite African people traveled as free people to the New World during slavery. That she came as a young girl and she saw what was going on and she joined the Maroons. I don't know, nobody really knows for sure what it is, or at least I don't know. But anyway, she became a Maroon. A Maroon is, a Jamaican Maroon is the runaway slaves first, and the Spanish, then the British, maybe a few Tainos, Indians if they were there. I believe there's a shipwreck of people from Madagascar who may have been Muslim there too, and they all went to the mountains, and they resisted. They fought against the British. They raided British plantations, and really became trouble because Jamaica was such an important place for the British. So ultimately, the King of England declared war against the Maroons, sent many, many ships of hundreds, if not thousands of soldiers, the British Army, to fight the Maroons. And the Maroons fought them to a standstill. You can determine who won. I'm not sure. Some people say the British just gave in to the Maroons. Some people say the Maroons won. But in that case, somewhere about 1740, I believe, they signed a treaty. There are several Maroon groups in Jamaica, the Windward Maroons, the Leeward Maroons. But anyway, Queen Nanny was a very important Maroon leader. And she was really a strategist. She didn't, I understand, fight physically, but she arranged a strategy, psychological strategy, military strategy against the British. She used the horn, their bang, through which she developed codes, and they could send codes for miles to communicate. The British didn't have that. They didn't have really guns except the ones that they captured in battle. But they killed many hundreds of British people. But Queen Nanny became feared by the British, revered by her followers, and ultimately now a major figure in Jamaican history. Interestingly enough, some of the best history about Queen Nanny that I've read was first developed in California, Berkeley and Stanford, and which is interesting. So it was a very global person. It's not just simply some local person that people developed stories about. So that's Queen Nanny of the Maroons.
Usually when I have a conversation with an artist, I usually start with questions about process. So far, we've talked almost entirely about subject matter, because it's so interesting. But I wonder how you, what is your process in creating these? What kind of approach do you take? Because these are very, very layered, very, complicated, dense paintings. I'm wondering how you approach them.
Well, thank you. Well, quite apart from the abstract pattern, just first of all, sometimes I have an idea, and I toy around with it in my head for a long time. I usually work at 6 and 7 paintings at a time. And during the course of a year or two, I'll finish maybe 3 or 4 in a year, but they will have been in my head for sometimes 2 or 3 years before actually getting to either completion or place of satisfaction. I'll have an idea, and I'll toy around with it, and then I'll begin to draw or paint it. I don't do drawings. Most of my friends I know do a lot of, I never draw. I never do preparatory sketches, ever. I have an idea, and I try to put it down. And I know that it's not going to be what I put down. I'm very comfortable with frustration. I know that the idea that I start with is not going to be what it ends up with. But I found out from my own experience that if I draw my ideas out first, I tend to end up with something that's more illustrative or more neutralized than I would like. So I allow myself the frustration of what I'm doing not going to be and I change it. I'm constantly changing things until I get something that I like. And oftentimes I'll get it for 2 or 3 months and I don't like it, and I change it again, change parts of it. And the idea that I develop goes along with the composition. Usually, the compositional idea guides the subject matter, interestingly, not the other way around. I will start with the subject matter, and if the composition bores me, I will change it. And then I'll try to figure out what other kind of subject matter works with it. And sometimes it's a hybrid. But what that does, it keeps testing my psychology. It keeps me challenging my inner self to recognize that what I'm trying to get at is not my conscious mind. When I taught, I tell students, you have your conscious mind, which your conscious mind keeps you out of trouble. Don't drink too much. Don't jump off the cliff. you know, don't do all of the things that you aren't supposed to do to stay out of jail. Your subconscious mind keeps saying, go for it. I said, but you know, the interesting thing about art, it's the one place where you can let your subconscious mind go without any consequence. At least in this country. In this country, people don't even care enough about art to put you in jail, right? In some countries that do. In this country, see, you know, I said, just use your subconscious. Let it take you where the hell you want to go. It wants to go. And then after you're in a total mess, you're totally confused, you have no idea what the hell you're doing, then let your conscious mind trying to solve your problem. That's how I work.
So before we open this up to questions from the assembled, are there any other particular paintings that you'd like to talk about?
Briefly, maybe that one over there, right behind us, which is called Transcendence, this one here. Again, it started out to be some kind of a plantation burning, and I completely got away from that after a while. But what it ended up being is about a plantation, which is an ancient one, old one, or a modern one. It's a plantation. It's about slavery, about slaves working it. But that's in the background. In the foreground, in the circular form, there are pots. And what they're doing is they're making pots. And to me, it's as if they're one and the same group of people. The people who are slaves as well as the pot makers. But what I was trying to get to in that is that in slavery, people suffered, but people are often also very intelligent, and they also had dreams. And their dreams created me. Their dreams created people today. And so I'm using the pots as a metaphor for the beautiful things that they created. And the pots go back to Africa because, as you may know, for a while, you know, African pottery was really sold into Greece. Much of what people know as Greek pottery was actually made in Africa and sent to Greece through the so-called Silk Road. And so the tradition of making pots, African pots, is something that's been around for a while. So I try to do both of those in that painting, and in fact having to do with curvilinear forms and rectangular forms and working out relationships between the two. The painting next to it, which I call a caravan for Ouida, is in a similar way. It's a caravan going toward the Ouida slave port, which is outside of Benin on the West African coast, and one of the infamous slave ports. And again, it's the enclosure. You are in the space. We are in the space. We are in the caravan. But you're not really showing people. I'm showing the wares that they carried, some of the spiritual things that made America beautiful, America North, South, and Central beautiful, with slaves brought to them, drums, music, patterns, and so on and so forth. So as slaves came to work and do things, they also carried beautiful, powerful things with them. And for me, the irony is that they're going to the Ouida slave port. It's unknown. They don't know what's on the other side of that. They don't know anything about Europe. But these are Africans carrying them to the slave port. But Africans in the Americas have populated not only the Americas, North and South, with their ideas, but have taken it back to Europe and back to Africa. So much of Africa is inspired by African Americans. So for me, it's like the slaves taking things with them, and which they would later use to populate the world. So it's part of that.
Okay, one more process question. The watercolors are gorgeous.
Thank you.
And you might just talk a little bit about your technique, because I've never seen such dense, beautiful watercolors.
Thank you very much. I approach the watercolors the same way that I do the oils. I don't draw, I don't plan them. But oil or acrylic. But technically there are differences. In the oils or in the acrylics, I can change by erasing, by painting out things. Watercolor is a very unforgiving medium, as you may know. if you want to keep it transparent, you can't really paint it out. You can only paint over it. So what happens a lot in the watercolors is that the ideas are transformed by necessity. By the very fact that I can't change things, often my ideas expand. So it's like the opposite process, the opposite result. Not subtraction, but addition in the watercolors. And the watercolors are all transparent watercolors. I don't believe there's any opacity. I don't use any white or whatever it is. I just do one color on top of another. But watercolors, as you may know, you have to pre-think. And oftentimes I think 10, 15 colors ahead of time. And I love music. And one of the interesting things I love music is which I can't do, is how musicians count. That in a symphony orchestra, the bassist can count. He can count to 70, 80, 90 before he comes in. I remember hearing somebody, I forget, was somebody who was new to the Chicago Symphony Orchestra. And he said to Fritz Reiner, the door conductor of the Chicago Symphony Orchestra, he says, well, maestro, how will I know when to come in? He says, count. Right? So musicians are accustomed to thinking well and well and well and well ahead of time. Arturo Toscanini said about singers, he says, singers don't think ahead. He says, singers forget easy. He says, singers forget easy. Instrumentalists have to remember things. And so in the watercolors, I tend to work like that. I count, I think ahead. If I want to get to a dark blue, I know I'm going to have to start with a light pink. I know I can't do brown because if I'm going to get to dark blue, the brown is going to turn green. So I have to think way ahead of time, and I enjoy that process. It's a different part of my personality. And so that's it.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Let's open it up for questions. Does anybody have a question here? There's a microphone coming to you.
Cousin Keith,
Hello, cousin.
it's an honor to see your work and
Thank you.
to hear your thoughts. I have a question for you about your process, more so before the museum started calling, what kept you painting?
Before what, I'm sorry?
Before the museums and institutions started calling you to present your work, what kept you painting?
Oh, thank you. I think it's probably the same that keep most artists, and many are in the room here, painting. It's just your own soul, your own need to explore your ideas, to do them. You hope people will buy them or like them or show them or whatever, but you don't really begin there. In fact, you don't even end there. It's something you need to do, something you need to get out, and something you need to, to show other people or to show yourself. Okay. You're welcome.
Any other questions here? Let's see.
Thank you. Keith, great to see your work, and
Hey, Dan,
I do have a
thank you.
question about visual evaluation, about you looking at your work. Is there a time of day that you look at it early in the morning, late at night, both?
The time that I look at them,
Yes, when you look at them to decide where you want to take them.
thank you. I'm kind of slipshod. I look at them anytime. I look at them in day, night, on the electricity, under whatever. And in fact, they change if you move them from different places. I'm really not that technical about it, really. That's that question.
Okay.
Okay.
Hi, Keith. So nice to see you. Thank
Thank
you
you.
for sharing all of this beauty with us.
Thank you.
There are two pieces I'm just mesmerized by, this blue piece behind you. And
This one?
yes, it's incredible. And I also wanted to ask you about the social, you said commentary in some of these more floral pieces.
Mm-hmm.
I see little white figures hidden in the background. And in the blue, I see a box at the bottom of the boat there.
Yeah.
And I love the way the curtains are almost drawing the ship along. It's such a beautiful piece.
Thank you. It's this shape here is like a sail, and there's sails there, and there's a mast of a ship. And if you look, you can see the British flag there. And the title, I think, is the subtitle is called Rule Britannia. You know, and they still say it, Rule Britannia, Britannia rule away. Never, never shall Britons be slaves, or something of that sort. And I grew up British, and of course the interesting thing is the Bank of Barclays Bank, Lloyd's of London, the British Museum, those are all financed by slavery. You know, all the wonderful things we love. The King of England once had a huge slave business going in the middle of Africa. I grew up around wonderful people, great people, Sir Francis Drake, Sir John Hawkins, what's the other one? Forget momentarily. Only later there were slavers, most of them. So the idea of use of this is really a knock at the British, in a way. But I explore a lot of abstract things in it, you know, and so it's layered. It's once about slavery, but it's also about abstraction.
I was just curious if you could talk a little more about the layered meanings in your really lush paintings of imaginative Jamaica-like places.
The meanings?
The layered meanings that you talked about, because I think I was curious to know, I mean, they are very beautiful and lush.
Thank you.
And that can be overwhelming in a way, and you can get kind of lost in that in a really wonderful way. But you alluded to the fact that there were sort of layered meanings there.
Yes.
And I wondered if you could talk about that a little bit, and also whether you care if people get to those, or if you think about people, whether they get to those meanings or not.
Somewhat. I think people, I'm one of those people, once you put a work of art out there, people should take from it what they want or what's in it. And I have this thing about my art is that it leaves me alone and I leave it alone. You know, once it's done, it has and people often say things about my art that I have no idea that it was there. But if it sounds good, I'll take it. I usually return it. So it doesn't matter. You know, like this one here, which I called, I think, Scenes of Childhood. I mean, it's layered in the sense that it's pretty, it has all of these wonderful things. And in a sense, it's kind of like camouflage. When I grew up, or where I grew up, along the seashore, there were some beautiful things, but there were also some terribly dangerous things. There were scorpions, there were centipedes, very dangerous things, but they looked pretty. And as a child, I remember my mother was pulling me away from that. I said, that's a very, very dangerous thing. And the idea of something being beautiful, but also being very dangerous, all put together as one, was interesting to me. And this is kind of a painting, a whimsical painting about that. It has different kinds of animals in it. It has toys, children's toys, an airplane that's flying through there. You have turtles. You have different kinds of birds and so on. You also have a couple of dogs humping there. And this painting has been blown up to about, besides that wall, in the Philadelphia airport.
We should have done that.
Pardon?
We should have done that.
It was blown up about the size of the wall. And when the curator for the airport they took it away, they're photographing it. And I said, you sure you want this painting? She said, yes. I said, there are dogs humping in that. I should tell you that before you put this up. She looked, she said, oh my God, there is. But she used it anyway, and it's been up since January, and I saw it for the first time a couple of weeks ago. And I said, you didn't get in trouble? She said, nobody's noticed it yet. I don't know why people don't notice that. But there are all kinds of naughty things going on in that painting, as indeed in several of them.
So, Keith, this is, I'm over here, sir. Mel Hardy, I'm from Philly.
Yeah.
And we knew each other.
Yes.
Good to see you.
Good to see you too.
So, you're from Jamaica, as was Claude McKay. As we think about the impact that McKay had during the Harlem Renaissance, I often think of you not only with your painting, but the influence that you had on legions of your students.
Thank you.
At Tyler, I mean, I know a lot of them, and they were very impactful. So in the matter of this layering, this languaging that you give sub rosa to the painting, the overt stuff, but then there is the stuff of other meaning. Could you speak to that lineage that you Jamaicans have from McKay to you in influencing American culture?
Well, thanks. That's a big order. I'm terribly flattered if you put in that company. You know, you mentioned Claude McKay. I knew his brother. I didn't know at the time that it was his older brother. In fact, I didn't know at the time it was his brother. He was a friend of my parents. He's a huge man. I remember him, he had this kind of hardware store, and he lived upstairs. And he always had this huge fire going. And he ate rabbit and bread. I always remember the smell of rabbit and bread entering Mr. McKay's house. Later on, I found it was Claude McKay's brother. But I wouldn't necessarily, I'm flattered that you put me in that lineage. But you know, Jamaican people, Caribbean people in general, and certainly Jamaican people very emphatically, are nomadic. You go just about anywhere in this world, you find Jamaicans. I mean, one of my favorite aunt practiced medicine. She lived in Austria, she lived in Vienna. And I'd call her from the airport and my cousin would answer. And the most sing-song, I said, Marlene, I don't speak a word of German, but I know no German and appreciate that sing-song Jamaican accent. But Jamaicans live everywhere. But the thing is, we're nomadic not just because we go away, but psychologically. I grew up around people, in fact, even very poor people. And when you'd meet them on the street, their pride was to say, my son is in England, or my cousin is in so-and-so. And for them, that meant success. Now, in the States, my family and friends, success means you come back home. But I grew up around people for whom success meant they're abroad. They hadn't seen them in 20 years. But it means that they were abroad doing something. And the idea of traveling, being the wanderer, in a sense, is a part of the Caribbean ethic. You know, they tell me there are probably more than 10% of people living in the United States are of Caribbean ancestry. It's not just 0.5%. It's a huge number of people. And that's been going on for a long, long, long time. From the 19th century, whatever it is. My grandmother was my grandfather's wife was born in the United States. So people have been traveling, they live in Panama for years, building the Panama Canal. Caribbean people have traveled all over before there were visas and the like. And after visas, people got stuck in different countries, in Haiti, whatever it is. And so they became Haitian or became Cuban, whatever it is. But or in New Orleans, or in the Carolinas. They've been traveling all over all the time. And so that sense of being global is a Caribbean, I won't say ethic, it's a Caribbean tradition. And I don't know necessarily what Jamaican art is or what Cuban art is in any isolation. Or we know something about Haitian art, but not really that much. But there's a whole Caribbean ethic of going somewhere else, making your world there, adding to it, taking back, going back and forth, in a way that most other Americans that I know don't do, or have not had that tradition, for whatever reason, okay? People who are British come here, they're British and they stay here. They may go back to visit, but they stay here. German people I know come here and they stay here. Caribbean people have this going back and forth all the time. I know Filipinos do that a lot. And interesting enough, there are a lot of Filipinos in Jamaica now, as you may know. Jamaican government made a contract to bring many Filipinos there maybe 30 years ago. But Filipinos do that too. They're in Brazil, they're in Italy, they're in England, whatever it is. And Jamaicans do that a lot in a similar way.
There's a Philippine artist in the gallery next door to you.
I know.
That's right. So,
and my wife is Filipino. And my son was raised in the Philippines.
So maybe 2 more questions. Here, let's hear some.
So, Keith, these two paintings. Hello, can you hear me? Yeah. These two paintings, which you talked about, just seem, you know, the word transformative is overused, but somehow the kind of process you had to go through, the time you started painting, to the time you could envision this, because it reflects just not your own thinking, but a vast cultural change and a way to reimagine, you know, what race is and who we are and what really happens with people. That process just amazes me. And
Thank you.
I wonder, was it hard? Did you suffer, or was it joyous? Or everything?
I'm not really kind of a suffering artist in a sense, but in another sense I am. You know, I try to make my paintings not to be about me. I try to get it so it's beyond me, that I may be in them, but then I'm as much a victim of the painting as anything else in it. And oftentimes the paintings I paint aren't necessarily about things I believe in. I don't mean that I paint about things I don't believe in. I mean there are things which are larger than my own relatively simple belief system. And they kind of like take me into another world. I want to get my paintings to say where they leave me, and they become something where I say, I'm not really sure what the hell that came from, but it's real. It's real. You know? So it's a little bit like that.
I noticed some of your labels are a little bit fairly elaborate and tell the story of the painting. And you know, there's a lot of discussion and debate right now in the art world about the relationship between text and the work. Do you feel that the labels enhance, alter, are necessary for an understanding, or could you go to one of your paintings and not know anything about
that's
references,
interesting.
historical references?
Thank you. That's interesting. The labels in this came out somewhat by accident. The curator, Judith Stein, and I were exchanging ideas. She had asked me things about things, and I'd send her some notes, just some thoughts. I had no idea that she'd send them to the Katzen to be part of the labels until I saw the Katzen and then sent them to me. And I said, where the hell did I get these from? And I remember, these are the things I sent to Judy. I kind of edited a couple of them because they were kind of like dicey, you know, but basically, that's why they all don't have labels, because it just simply happened to be some notes that I had sent to her in the middle of the night. But typically, I don't really, you know, use texts. I'm not a text artist. I write a lot using another hat. I never write about my own work, interesting. But so, you know, it's interesting you should mention that. Yeah, I wish, in fact, there'd been text to some others, but the text just came that way.
I know there are lots more questions, but we're going to have to wrap it up, but you'll be around for a little bit. Maybe you can come up and talk to Keith. Keith, thank you so much.
You're welcome.
Great
Thank
talk.
you. Thank you.